I remember before I met Paola talking to Michael Warsaw, who is the CEO of EWTN, the big boss man. And I was met him in Washington D.C. in the corridors, and you see him coming down. Mr. Warsaw, hey kid, how are you? Who the hell? He's like, who the heck is this guy? I'm like, we were talking for a moment, and he said, "So how's everything with you? Good, good." And I said, "Yeah, and I want to meet someone, and I'd love to maybe look at what's next on the horizon, get married." He goes, "Oh," he said, "Pray to Mother Angelica." He said, "Pray to Mother Angelica." So after we got married, I met him again down in Florida recently at a conference in Naples, Florida. And I said, "Mr. Warsaw," and I said, "I did what you said. I prayed to Mother Angelica, and look who I'm after marrying." And he looked at her photograph and he said, "This could count as one of her miracles."
So we're going to be touching on, as you know, some of the themes that Archbishop Eamon mentioned from Pope Francis's message for World Day of Communications this year. He addresses it obviously to all of us, but he does specifically address those who are involved in communications. So I think it would be a good place to start that, since you are those, like he asked you to be communicators of hope, to hear just a little bit more about both your backgrounds. I believe you were both child prodigies when it came to communications. So I might start with Paola.
Thank you so much, Petra. And we're so lucky to be here, so excited, so honored. And I was very impressed by Archbishop Eamon's introductory words, because that's exactly the message we're going to try to convey through our talk, how we do that with our day-to-day job. My name is Paola Arriaza. I'm a Spanish speaker, so please be merciful with me. And I come from El Salvador, a tiny, tiny little country in Central America that's often called America's Thumb for its size. And from a family, we're 7 kids. And that's where I started learning communication, as the eldest of 7. And then I moved to Spain. I had the great opportunity to study in an Opus Dei college, University of Navarre, where I did not only learn journalism and philosophy, but I also learned the importance of your job when it comes to earning heaven, how you can do wonderful things with your job and how you can spread the good word of God with it. And that's what brought me to Rome. I started with Noticias Telemundo, an American broadcast for Latin American speakers, also all over the US. And I was their Vaticanist, their Vatican correspondent. And that's how I got to know Pope Francis a little bit better, day to day, following his general audiences on Wednesday, his Angelus on Sunday, his meeting with political figures, his encounters with pilgrims. So to me, it was a learning communication from him was also very wonderful. And now we've experienced the last conclave, and being able to report with EWTN for that has also been amazing. Yes.
We're going to definitely jump into more about Pope
Yes.
Francis and about things, but I believe you used to do like little plays for your brothers when you were.
How do you know that?
Tell us
Yes.
about that.
Literature was my access to journalism, I'd say. I loved reading beautiful stories, and since they're all younger than me, they used to pay attention to me, the kids, and we would act for our neighbors. And yes, that's true.
Then Colm, yourself.
Well, first of all, I'm Colm, and it's great to see everyone. Most important thing, I'm Paola's husband. Lucky enough to be Paola's husband. Just recently married 6 months ago.
In Ireland.
I know some of you, when you look on, if you didn't know that, you look at her and you look at me and you say, "How did that happen? How did?" It's like watching Beauty and the Beast, the two of us up here. But like Paula, similarly, I grew up with a love for communicating, with a love at a very young age for broadcasting. And even if I couldn't articulate it back then, there was just something about the idea of spreading a message, being able to touch so many people. And I remember I see Father Brendan Quinlivan is at the back of the hall. The very first job that I did was with Clare FM, my local radio station, on their religious program, Beyond Belief. And from that moment, from the around the age of 16, I was hooked with being in broadcasting. The funny thing is, the irony that when I started in Clare FM, it was the week that Pope John Paul II had passed away. And I went out on the streets of Ennis for the first time with a microphone and over to the poor Clares, asking them about their memories of the late Holy Father. And little did I know that all these years later, I'd end up working at the Vatican. So it's pretty incredible, that they say you make plans and then God just has a good laugh. But worked in Clare FM for a number of years. Then I went to RTE. I worked in a program you might remember called the John Murray Show.
Oh, yeah.
So worked there behind the scenes with John and on air as well on Radio 1. Then that show finished and I went over to work on Nationwide in the Today Show. And then I wanted a bit of an adventure, so I went to New York for 5 years and I joined the BBC doing human interest stories, not necessarily religious ones, but stories about human life, sometimes about politics. Trump had his first term then. And the more I went across the US, I noticed there was a great openness to talk about faith. Here in Ireland at the moment, it felt a little bit suffocating for someone who wanted to talk about faith and not only talk about faith, but broadcast about it. When I was in RT, I heard the phrase WBD, that's worthy but dull,
Yeah.
move on. So I wanted to get away from that, and I found that in America there was an openness, there was a willingness, and there was an appetite. People wanted these stories of hope. So then EWTN asked me to come to Rome and to take up Vatican correspondent, and then that has changed now into international correspondent. So we fly all over the world covering stories of hope.
That's fantastic. And just to bring you back to your childhood as well, I believe you used to do a newsletter in your local.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Petra, you've done your research. We, again, even before I started in radio when I was a kid,
So what age are you about?
I think it was 11 or something or 12. I'd go around and ask the neighbors with a little pen and paper, what's going on here? And they'd say, oh, did you get a new car? Can I take? I would take notes and I would print Colm's newsletter and go around and hand it around the neighborhood. I was a disturbed child with many problems.
That was so funny.
Still trying to
That
deal
was
with
so
them.
funny.
Yeah.
Great. That was a brilliant story. So fantastic.
Well, Petra, from your childhood as well, we've uncovered, and we have a video clip on you.
Great. So listen, I mean, we will get in more to the actual communications message, but those days from the death of Pope Francis and the Novum Diales and the conclave and everything were just like from this perspective an amazing time, and you were both right there in the heart of it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about just that whole experience? Like, yeah, I just remember one particular thing that struck me. I was watching Sky News and I turned it on and there was a priest saying, it was, I think, the funeral mass of Pope Francis saying, and now the bread and wine is going to be changed into the body and blood of Christ. And there was just a moment of silence. And I thought, when out, it's amazing. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience of being right there in the heart of that?
You're going to go first?
Well, I'll say, just to pick up on your point straight away, that there, Finn was saying in his opening beautiful remarks about seeing signs of hope, and we see that now through our broadcasting, not only just in the stories that we're communicating, but in the reaction from the audience. And that is the emails that we get from people, the reaction from people on the street, but we get to see it in the viewing figures as well, the hard data that you can't argue with. And when you said, you're watching Sky News, a secular outlet, and you hear a priest say that and take a moment of silence, I had that kind of moment too when, we work for EWTN, which is wonderful, and we are communicating to mainly, the conclave is different because everyone is just trying to find information about it, so we do get a broader audience. But normally we're talking to people who are Catholics and they're interested in the faith. But to be called around the death of Pope Francis in the conclave by the Sunrise, the biggest breakfast show in Australia, who not only want to do one hit, but they're saying, can we book you, Colm, for a week to talk about this? And they're open to going a little bit deeper. They're being reverent in how they cross live to you over satellite. In Fox News, of course, you would maybe expect that and those kind of networks. But then, hi, Colm, this is CNN. Can you come on with Anderson Cooper? And we're going to have a priest on with you as well. Yeah. And normally you're waiting for, and then to balance the panel, we're going to have but no, we're going to have you from EWTN and this priest on
That's
as
right.
well.
That was really striking about it, is that quite often if you're on as a person of faith in the media, it's in a conflict situation, whereas this, not so much, yeah?
No, and I couldn't believe that too, that you're standing on CNN Live with St. Peter's behind you, you have a great conversation, it's respectful, and then, that's it. And you're waiting. So I think the openness, the people are looking for, as Archbishop Eamon Martin said, looking for that hope. And that's what I really sensed as well.
And that interest, you also mentioned something, Colm, if I may. They asked you why were so many people interested on this, and they said, well, maybe it's a big event. But you said, no, there's many big events going on. You have Eurovision, you have all these things, but
Yeah, it was, I forget when it was the BBC or it was on with someone where they started to get a little bit cynical and they said, Colm, why do you think there's such an interest here? They were talking about the media presence. There were journalists, thousands of journalists, literally a few thousand journalists were accredited to cover just the conclave. Why are they so interested? And then the presenter followed up, of course, with their own opinion and point of view and said, I think it's probably just because of Conclave, the movie, and the two popes. And I said, that surely is part of it, that it's put it into the zeitgeist. And he said, it's a big spectacle event. But big events happen all the time now. You turn on the X Factor, Britain's Got Talent. I mean, seeing fireworks and huge lighting, design and sets, we get them all the time. Um, watching a chimney, like he was saying, all these high definition cameras zoomed up to a chimney for days on end. I got the sense that people, whether they could articulate it or not, were they could sense there was something more profound going on here. They were looking at the beauty for television with the colors and the traditions. That's beautiful, makes for good television. But I think it was coming across through the broadcasts. And that was our challenge. And the great opportunity we had was to really get that across, that this is something different. There's something deeper and more profound happening here.
Paola, were you surprised? Did that surprise you, or were you blown away by that, or that whole experience and the level of engagement?
I think that was wonderful. I got many requests from CNN Chile, for instance, to cover these things that I wouldn't do during the year. But you asked us about how this personal experience was, not only professional, but personal. I think for us, it all started with the Urbi et Orbi, the final Urbi et Orbi that Pope Francis gave. And that message stuck with us because he said, they read it for him. As you know, he wasn't in very good conditions, but the message said, we are not made for death, we're made for life, and the resurrection is the proof of it.
Wow, yes.
And that was just before he passed away. So I think that set the tone for the rest of our broadcast. And that was the message of hope that we tried to convey. I was live every single day since Pope Francis's funeral until the election of the new Pope for, I think it was about a month or three weeks, an hour every single day, so it's a challenge, it's a marathon, and it's the challenge of conveying everything we see to people all over the world. I had message from kids at my own high school saying, we're watching this, we're watching the chimney, so I thought it was, to me, it was the proof of how the church is all over the world, seeing this huge interest. And then it wasn't only that, because we were at the end of Via della Conciliazione, which is right across, we have the Vatican, and we could see everyone who ran to the piazza at the moment of the Habemus Papam. But then it was so special because we had many broadcasters near us. We had CNN Espanol behind us. We had ABC in front of us. But at the moment where the new Pope was elected, I saw their faces. They were telling facts. They were narrating what they were seeing. Oh, but for us, you have no idea. I saw my co-presenter and he was all teary, So for us, it was such an intense moment of faith. And I think that's the extra that Catholic communicators can add to the world, and the message that they can convey is this extra,
Yeah. Listen, and I want to come back and talk about Pope Francis a little bit because we'll come back to that because even his own autobiography was called Hope. But just the experience. So most of your professional lives as Catholic broadcasters was with Pope Francis, and now you're just starting anew. So just want to talk a little bit about how is that? That's quite a big. It's like your father is gone and you've a new father. You know what I mean? Of course, it's all the same, but just that experience of now, you're covering a new Pope. Any thoughts initially on that?
Wasn't that impressive? Because we were still mourning Pope Francis, the 9 days of mourning, and but we saw how quickly the church organized itself. Do you think?
Yeah, and I was honest when I was on, whether it was with Miriam McCallaghan on Primetime or other networks, and they were saying people must be devastated around here and there. And yes, people were sad and upset, but then there was a sense of gratitude thinking back on his legacy. And Pope Francis was no spring chicken. He was suffering for the past couple of years. People could see that. And there was this natural feeling of instant hope as soon as he had passed, because the church springs into gear, these rituals and traditions going back hundreds of years, thousands of years, and then you have the anticipation and the hopefulness of a new pope. And there was great comfort in that the church goes on, it must go on, and there's inherent hope in that.
Wasn't it really a time of, like, you really felt in the, even with the sadness and all the whatever dramatics, it was a real time of hope. wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
remember, Petra, that because it was meant to be the canonization of Carlo Acutis on the very same day that Pope
That's
Francis
right.
is then
That's right.
laid to rest. So Rome was filled with young people,
People,
and
that's
those young people bring with them automatically the hope.
Yes.
So even leading into the funeral, I remember seeing, it reminded me of World Youth Day, because walking towards St. Peter's Square were just these throngs of crowds of young people coming from all over the world with smiles on their faces. And even though it was a sad occasion, you just looked around and you said, wow, because people like to lead you to believe, oh, the church is dying here and it's irrelevant there and this and that. And then you look around and you see flags of
So alive,
countries you've
yeah.
never seen of or heard of, and just a huge amount of smart young people all there for their faith.
Great. That's
And
amazing.
the proof of that was that 250,000 people went to the funeral, but then you would see the streets of Rome where people were lining up all the way to Santa Maria la Maggiore, St. Mary Major, and on the way there going through the Colosseum. So it was this powerful symbol of watching this white car crossing Rome. The city stopped, everybody stopped. It doesn't matter where you came from. I think it was
Yeah, it was amazing. And then you both had obviously travelled both with Pope Francis and following his entourage around lots. The one that always strikes me, I think you were both in Mongolia.
he was.
That really is impressive. So just to tell us a little bit about.
Never drink horse milk if you go to Mongolia.
I warned him.
Share that among friends now.
So just Pope Francis, just like what that experience was about being with him so often on his journeys of hope.
It was when I first joined the EWTN full time in Rome, coming from New York. I was there maybe a wet week, and my boss called me and said, "So you're going to go on your first apostolic trip?" I said, "Oh, great." You know, being a bit green and new to it, I was like, Where are we going to go? We're going to go somewhere nice like Malta or I think the Pope should go to the Bahamas." And he said, "You're going to Iraq with the Pope.
All right.
And can you come into the office because we need to fit you for a bulletproof jacket and helmet and all this, you and the cameraman." So, he talked about this in his book as well, his autobiography, Hope. And that was the amazing thing about traveling with Pope Francis, is because you got to see firsthand and up close him bringing hope, not just to Christian nations, but sometimes to places like Mongolia, as you say, to Papua New Guinea, to places where the Catholic population was tiny or even non-existent. Some countries where there were no Catholics at all. And in spite of the danger, for example, in Iraq, I think Pope John Paul II had tried to go in the late 90s or the early 2000s, and he was told, look, this is just too unsafe to go. In fact, Pope Francis was told by the British intelligence and by the Italian Secret Service that they had credible threats against his life. And we found out through his book that there were 2 attempts in his life when he was there. But he still decided to go to bring that message of hope in a country where, they've been so devastated by war and persecution. And in fact, we went back to Iraq last year to do a piece on the 10th anniversary of the ISIS invasion. But been seeing the power of the papacy and words, even though I was interviewing people, we did a program for the BBC there as well. And I remember interviewing young people outside of our hotel because we weren't allowed to go too far. And they were kind of modern young Iraqis, still wearing the hijab and everything. And I was saying, oh, what do you think about Pope Francis being here? And they said, oh, it's great because, he's so wonderful. And I said, you know who he is? He said, oh, he is famous. I remember one lady said to me on air, he is big famous man like Tom Cruise. They just saw a well-known person. And then she said, let me show you on Instagram. And she showed me on Instagram. But then under it, it said, #peace, #brotherhood. And I thought in that moment, when was the last time these words went viral in Iraq? So even though they didn't fully understand that him being the head of the Catholic Church, successor of Peter and so on, though these words were going viral in Iraq, and that's a powerful, powerful thing.
Or even in Mongolia, when you saw a little kid and he said, when is Pope Francis coming? I want to go get lunch.
That was funny. We were waiting for the Pope to arrive somewhere, and in Mongolia, it was an amazing trip because in other countries there are the crowds and you don't get anywhere near the Holy Father. In Mongolia, we got so close to the Pope because some people had come from mainland China, but they were staying back from the cameras and they were hiding their faces, and that was upsetting to see these Catholics fearing that they might be spotted on camera being there and whatever the repercussions may have been. But one young little Mongolian boy came up to me. You know when you meet a kid who's just so full of confidence, a little character. And he said to me, my cameraman, "What are you doing? You're waiting for the Pope?" I said, "Yeah, we are. Yeah, we are waiting for the Pope." He said, "Oh," and I said, "Are you going to see him?" "Yeah, when's he coming?" I said, "I think in around 30 minutes." And he said, "Oh, I haven't got the time." And I was like, "Fair enough, you got things to do." And he said, "Bye bye," and he walked away. And I was, kids got places to be, you know.
Because, yeah, 1,000 Catholics in Mongolia, that's it. You know?
Well, you got to go to. Well, you didn't go with the Pope, but
Cor-
ahead of him to Corsica. Was it?
Yes, we went to Corsica. That was his last apostolic trip, I think. And he wanted to highlight popular piety, so we went there. We spoke to different members of confraternities. We saw the white chair where he was going to sit to have lunch. We saw every little detail, and that was beautiful. But you were speaking about Hope, the autobiography. And my biggest memory of that moment is that Colm and I got married in December, and then newlywed couples have the opportunity to say hi personally to the Pope. It's called the Bachamano, you know? So we were able to do that. He was just coming from a trip, and I saw, because we did see Pope Francis every single day, so we saw how he wasn't feeling well, how he was getting worse and worse, and I thought, this is not good, he's not looking good, and I told Colin, we have to go today. We have to go see Pope Francis today. And my husband was a little bit tired, and he was like, "Oh, it's early. Maybe next Wednesday." And I thought, "No, we have to go this Wednesday." So that was his last general audience, and
And he died the following Monday, was it?
no,
Or
he
some-
died almost a month after.
He was hospitalized
Yes.
2 days.
2 days after,
wow.
and that
Yeah.
was really the
Amazing,
end of
amazing,
everything.
yes.
And that was it. So we were able to. I spoke to him in Spanish. He was past us, and I grabbed his hand because he only spent seconds with the newlywed couples, and I just held onto his hand, and I said, I spoke to him in Spanish, so he paid attention, and I said, "We're just married. We cover your everyday here at the Vatican, your papacy, your messages. We spread your messages throughout the world," and he signed a copy of his autobiography, Hope. And then he blessed this little image we brought from the Holy Family.
lovely,
So that was another moment of hope that,
gorgeous.
yeah.
Yeah. Great. And just thinking of that, and Archbishop Eamon mentioned it in his response to Pope Francis' message. There's a lovely phrase the Pope used in this document about being gold prospectors, that even when the world is full of bad news stories and negativity, and even in the church, that we have to be people who go and look for the gold. And Archbishop Eamon called on broadcasters to look for stories of hope. So, do you have a favourite story of hope that in your careers, either as in the mainstream media or as Catholic journalists, that would be your favourite example of one that you were involved in or that you experienced?
Yes. Okay. So my favorite story, I made that with EWTN Spanish. We went to Madrid because we knew that Gustavo Cervino, I don't know if this name rings a bell, Gustavo Cervino, he was one of the few survivors of the plane crash in the Andes Mountains. And I didn't know that they survived through faith because they spent there 72 days in freezing temperatures, minus 22 Fahrenheit degrees, just a rugby team,
It
20-year-olds.
was a rugby team that crashed at the very peak of the Andes, wasn't it? And
Yes.
were just completely stranded. Yeah.
Yes, they were crossing from Uruguay to Chile over the Andes Mountains. There was a failure on the plane and they crashed. Many of them died at that moment, but the ones who survived spent an ordeal of 72 days in a place where there's no food, there's no water, it's freezing cold. They even suffered different avalanches of snow. So it was like a life or death situation. And Gustavo Servino told me that in the cold of the night, when there was absolute silence because they were trying not to freeze to death, you could only hear the rosary beads. So it was a moment where they hold on to our mother. You know, they decided not to go crazy because you can absolutely go crazy under those circumstances. They decided to remain with all the values. Those were all Catholic boys. They went to actually an Irish school in Chile, the old Christian school, and they managed to survive that way. And two of them, at the very end of their stay there, two of them decided to walk for 15 days all the way to civilization, and they were praying the rosary constantly during that time there. and those who survived had made it their mission to carry the lives of those who passed. So it was a very beautiful story of faith and hope, and I think that's exactly what when we hear this message of disarming communications, and what does that mean? What does that actually mean? It means seeing the other person as another human being, being empathy, being able to recognize yourself in the other. And I think that journalists, through beautiful human interest stories like Gustavo Servino's one, can actually be able to accomplish some of that.
Brilliant. Yeah, I love that. That's beautiful. Yeah, that must have been very impressive. I love that phrase, disarming, and we might come back to that because, Pope Leo picked up on it as well. Colm, do you have your
Yeah, and as Paola said, I think the stories that connect with people the best are the human interest stories. Just hearing it firsthand from someone, a story of trials or tribulations or something they went through, how they were able to overcome it. And I think what's a great blessing that we have working with EWTN, like I said at the beginning, while other networks can sometimes say worthy but dull, we want the drama, we want the tension, we want the conflict. The great thing is that EWTN is we want the hope, we want the gospel message, we want the inspiration. And I've covered so many of them over the years, but there's one that stands out. When I lived in New York for 5 years, I remember spotting a story in Cleveland, Ohio, about a young girl. It was like a small piece in the New York Times in the medical section. The youngest person in history to get a face transplant, a full face transplant. And I thought this was fascinating. So I looked into the story more. And originally, it was not meant to be a religious story, it was for BBC television. So it was just going to be an incredible human story. And I flew to Cleveland, Ohio, met this woman who she was when she was 18 years of age in school. She was like the school beauty, the sweetheart of the university, and her boyfriend had broken up with her. So she thought it was the end of the world, and she went home and she took her brother's gun. And her mother, during the interview, said she was washing the dishes and she heard this big smack, and she dropped the dishes and she went upstairs, and her daughter had tried to take her own life, but she had put the gun at a wrong angle under her chin, and she had, instead of taking her life, she had survived it, but she had completely removed her entire face with the gunshot. So, I mean, talk about a cross for that family and a crucifixion for them and what they must have went through. So she waited for a few years until they could find someone with the exact same blood type, and all these things had to match up medically for her to get a new face. So some woman in her 30s then had died of a drug overdose, and they were able to remove that person's face, stitch it onto her face, and it's something incredible. But when I was interviewing them, again, this was not for EWTN. At the end, I had just gotten an incredible story from the mom and the dad, and she had spoke too, even though her speech was very difficult to understand, and we subtitled it on the BBC. But the final question, I had everything in the bag, and I thought, well, look, while we're here, I said, so what? Anything else that helped you get through this? And the father said, oh, yes, over the past 2 years, we converted to the Catholic Church. And he didn't know I had anything to do with Catholicism or EWTN on the side. And that's when I leaned in. I was really? I said, what do you mean? You can? And he said, yeah, we were Baptist, but we found solace in the Catholic faith. And that's what helped us get through this. Now, at a time when you would think, if there is this all-loving, beautiful God, why would you do this, the most horrific thing to my family and my child? But the father, the head of the house, uh, they all converted to Catholicism and got through it. And and I made sure that was in the BBC story, because sometimes when you're dealing with your editors, you've got an argument, you've only a certain amount of time, and no, this is the most important part of the story. I think it got 10 million views on YouTube, and then it went out around the world on television. And we did another version then for EWTN.
did you feel kind of tingle at the back of your neck when they said we found faith through it? That's an amazing moment. Yeah.
I couldn't believe it,
Yeah.
and thought, what? And then all the technical things, we only have the crew for a certain amount of time, and because this is a whole other discussion we have to get into. But it was just,
Yeah.
and sometimes I think it's good if it's just mentioned and left there, because sometimes I like to do maybe stealth Catholicism.
Yeah.
So even when you're pitching a story, you don't say, hey, I've got a great Catholic story I want to pitch you, because they might say, oh, no. Say, hey, I've got a great human interest story.
Yeah. Great.
And
Well,
then it just happens.
I was exactly going to ask you about that. Is that so? Again, Pope Francis mentions that Christian hope has a face, and it's the face of Jesus Christ. Okay, so obviously in EWTN context, when you're broadcasting in a Catholic context, that can be a natural part of it. But that's very interesting what you were saying is how do you bring that? You've both worked in mainstream media. So how to bring that, like, how to bring that message of Jesus Christ that is like a person, even mention that name. Um, you've mentioned a great example of it, but just even Paola, did you have that experience as well of how do you bring your faith into a kind of a secular context as well?
Well, my experience, as I was always their Vatican correspondent, they were expecting from me
Right,
that
okay.
element. But I found it very interesting that news outlets like Telemundo or CNN, it was better. It was broadcasting, but it was also explaining to them certain elements of our faith that they might not know.
Yeah.
That you cannot, maybe people from EWTN that are watching EWTN every single day, they might know those things. But it was explaining the ABC kind of things. And I thought that only proved that there was a huge interest on those things. And yes, but I think you have a greater example there.
Well, because yeah, when Paola started, she was put in straight away out of university at a Vatican role. But when I started off in Radio 1 and RTE, it was just in a mainstream daytime, huge national talk show, 9 a.m. in the morning. And I realized, yeah, if I went in pitching ideas that I thought were very interesting and worthy and should be on air. I remember going in once talking about an Irish nun, Sister Ethel Normoyle from my neck of the woods from County Clare, who had worked for years in South Africa and Port Elizabeth and worked through apartheid, and just an incredible story. But because of the time, because of the abuse stories that were coming out and the understandable anger from many people, then there was a reluctance to touch many of those stories. So then I kind of tried to get smarter about it as well with the BBC. For example, I remember a few years ago, 2 years ago, the BBC coming to me and saying, "Look, Colm, we want you to do um, a special for Christmas. It'll be on radio and television, so I was going to get a huge global audience, but we want something that's all inclusive and this and that and yada yada." And I was like, okay. And I had a connection with Andrea Bocelli, the singer. So then I went back to them and I said, "We have it. Brilliant. We're going to do Andrea Bocelli. Oh, great, great. Yeah, what's he going to talk about? His music, his life. He'll talk about how he made his albums and this." Knowing that when I sat down with Andrea, first question, what inspired Jesus Christ inspires me. And I said, "Oh, really? Yeah, what's been the highlight? Singing for the three popes I got to sing with." I'm like, "We, and
Brilliant.
what would you like to do next? Everything that glorifies God." So it was just, I remember someone texted me from London and I said, "Am I listening to a half an hour of Catholicism on the BBC?" But, mixed in with the music and everything. We made a beautiful program. But then afterwards, the reaction is huge. The numbers are huge. So it strengthens your armor. I tell this to young people in communication that then, these wins and when things are produced at a certain level, you make them look extremely, extremely good. It strengthens your armor because you can say then to commissioners or producers, well, it may not be your cup of tea, but we serve our audience, public service broadcasting,
That's right.
taxpayers' money, and look at the figures. So I mean, it worked.
Yeah,
More
and
of
I
that.
definitely think as well sometimes if we come with that kind of a confidence in it and say this is a great story because you can kind of be apologetic.
And Petra, just to say as well, and a little bit of boldness as well, to be able to question why are we not interested in covering this? No, but really, why not? What element of the story is not engaging here?
Yeah.
And I wish I knew that back then when I was starting off. But through apartheid and helping those in most need and all this, what's element of the story we're missing here to put it on?
And the quality of our work, I think that's why we need to be great professionals. Catholic communicators need to be excellent on the techniques. They need to be excellent on their public speaking things. They need to be convinced of what they're saying. And
Yeah.
I think people buy genuine things.
Like, I mean, that whole thing again of disarming communication. I love that phrase because it means, oh, they had a disarming smile. And so you both are disarming just naturally. But then Pope Francis also talks about it as being a hard work thing. So just, do you want to say a little bit about, as well as the content of your work, your kind of approach to your work, like how you engage with people, which is also a part of being such a contrast to the big temptation on social media is if you say something dramatic and negative, you get loads of clicks. But like, do you want to say a little bit about that, about how you live that in just the way you are?
Well, I think the great thing about being a Vatican correspondent is that the Vatican is so interesting and the church is so interesting. Everything happens every single day. The amount of people that go through the Vatican walls, you have no idea. This story comes to mind. Every Christmas, Pope Francis made a concert for the poor. Concerto per i poveri, the concert for the poor. It was wonderful. They brought the best orchestra, they brought the best directors, they had the best quality, and the guest of honor were the poor, the most in need in Rome. And it was about 7,000 people who would go there, and they would even get a meal after. They were treated like kings and queens, and that is the message of a church, the church, a poor church for the poor. And to me, that was so beautiful and impressive. And I went to the last Concerto per i Poveri, and I saw that Hans Zimmer was the director that was going to be playing for that amount of people. And you would hear Pirates of the Caribbean inside the Vatican, and you would hear all those orchestra, those wonderful interstellar moments. And I think that's an amazing thing. The Vatican is so full of wonderful stories. So everybody can be interested in that. They're all appealing.
Yeah. So another thing, though, and I think it would be odd to have a conversation about hope and not to say that, I mean, the time that you need most hope is when things are dark or negative. And I mean, the great thing about working in the church context is that there is good news. But there are times, for instance, the abuse crisis, when we have to speak to the world about things that are dark and hard. So would you like to talk about and I suppose that's the time that you most need to kind of think, well, we need hope here more than any time, yeah?
Yeah, and I think tackle them straight on is what I think is the best thing to do, and be honest and be transparent. And that's what I've found, how I've been able to work with EWTN, but continue my work with the BBC and with RTE, is that you have to make it bulletproof. And as Paola was saying, she made the great point, because we're broadcasting into all these channels, in terms of your producing and your storytelling, it has to look A1 as well, technically and from a storytelling point of view. But then in terms of the content, I think what makes us different is not that we're shying away from stories. I came here to Dublin. Archbishop Dermot Martin here as well did a great interview with me around the whole wave of the last abuse from the schools.
Yeah.
And, I'll be honest, among all of us here, what was challenging for me is that when we were coming to do this, we rang some of the victims and said, look, we want to interview you and hear your point of view, and it will be for EWTN. And they all agreed to come and be on camera, of course, and very difficult for them to do, but they said, we'll do this. And then even for me, as someone who working for EWTN, it was very difficult to get the religious orders. And in fact, I think we had some lined up, but one by one, up until the broadcast, they said, actually, we don't want to do it. Now, thankfully, Dermot Martin did a great interview, and that gives people hope. Seeing him on camera,
Yes.
this is the church taking accountability,
Yeah.
and he spoke so well. And again, with us, we are. I'm a broadcaster who's Catholic. I like to say I'm not a Catholic broadcaster, in that, I'm not working for the church. And there are some journalists around Rome and around the Vatican who turn more into activists than they are journalists. But what we can do differently, maybe than other networks, is that we can keep it fair, and we will always give the church a fair hearing. And, I even say to them, I say, look, we afford you the same things that when we say to the victims, this is a difficult subject. We'll give you time to answer. We'll give you space to answer. If something goes terribly wrong and you want to try something again, and other networks wouldn't do this, but we say, same to the church.
Yeah.
Time to answer, time to be heard. And I think most reasonable people watching, when they see the cleric on screen and saying naturally, this is terrible what happened, but we have the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, we have strong safeguarding measures, things are different. In terms of hope, it gives people great hope. And I think the church needs to be better at that, just being a little bit bold and going out there, owning it, and then saying, but look, that was then, this is now, and it's a very safe place to be.
Yeah. That was Archbishop Dermot Farrell, was it?
Dermot Farrell, beg your pardon,
Yes.
Dermot Farrell, yes.
Yeah, very good. That's great. Yeah, Paola, did you have can you think of it? I know again, if you're working in that concept, just a time when it was a difficult.
Well, I think I stand by what you just said, and it's when you hear victims, when you see that they feel alone, the church is supposed to be like our mother, Our Lady, and she was welcoming and she embraced. And I think that those abuse cases and mistakes are a great toll on the church, a great toll on good priests,
Yeah.
because we lose credibility. So it's always great to accompany. It's always great to take care of them. I interviewed the new secretary for the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, and he studied psychology as well. So they were prepared to face this kind of things. It's a Vatican building. It's located inside the Vatican walls, and I just think that states and emphasizes the fact that this is something important, and we're working on it, and we are supporting the victims, we're supporting the survivors, and we are also preventing it, which is a great part of it.
Okay, great. And then it must be quite interesting that you have worked as colleagues and now you're working together as a married couple.
She wants to kill me sometimes.
Oh my!
Is that off the record or on the record?
But
So I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about just that has that changed the way you work professionally or anything like that?
well, he doesn't work at the office. He works from a coffee shop nearby.
Okay.
But no, but I think it's beautiful because we truly complement each other. I think just by the fact that I speak Spanish, he speaks English, so we're able to create those two kinds of stories together. We went to Argentina to right before Pope Francis died to record his life, the people, the places that made the man who would become Pope Francis. I was translating for Colm. Colm was helping me get the best angle on the camera, or you were scripting. So we were helping each other, and I think that is great.
And that was high pressured because, it's a very expensive game. To make good television is extremely expensive. And you're there for only a certain amount of days with a lot of scenes you have to film in locations.
No sleep.
No sleep at that. How many people were on that cruise? 7 or 9 people?
Yes.
And we had someone from
Argentina,
Argentina, with someone from Russia,
Colombia.
with some
On the crew.
on
which-
the
the
crew.
crew.
Yeah, just we tried to pick the best. Who's the best cameraman? Who's the best this and that? The best producers. So as the producer of it, I'm as well as presenting it. I have to coordinate all these people, and then you've got issues and things going wrong, or
You're under pressure.
we're under
And
pressure.
that's out, that has been broadcast, has it?
It's funny because we were planning to edit it and broadcast it before Pope Francis. We didn't know when he was going to pass away. We thought we were going to have a little bit longer,
Yeah.
but as soon as we came back,
Yeah, died.
he passed away. Yeah.
Yes.
We have published some of those stories, a
Yeah.
couple of them.
On the anniversary of his
Yeah.
death, we'll publish the full documentary.
Okay, great. And then just having that must be quite an interesting experience because Pope Francis has been Pope for the last, what was it, 12 years. So you kind of think, well, we know all about him. Was there things there that surprised you that you were thinking, okay, well, that's that's an interesting thing. And
Well, I think it helped us understand him better. And we met Cardinal Dree, who was his confessor for a period in Buenos Aires, and he spoke about mercy. So it was one part of the puzzle, mercy, such an important theme for him. Then we went to the villas, which are Via Miseria, which are the most dangerous, most poor parts of Argentina, where him as an archbishop, him as a priest, I think,
Yeah.
he would go visit the families there. He would know the local priest there. He would walk those streets alone, which I thought was incredible.
We got a police. We went to film in the villas, and we went in with the parish priest, and he was showing us around, and he said, "You're safe." And then
We left.
after an hour, we had woo, 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 woo. These police all turned up, and they said, "Oh no, we'd been tipped off that there were guys going by on motorbikes, eyeing up all your equipment and ready to pounce." So they escorted us out of the villas.
Wow.
All these police officers.
amazing.
The one thing that was interesting about Argentina, one part of the puzzle we couldn't solve was why Pope Francis had never
Come
returned
back.
home to
Yes.
Argentina.
Yeah.
And it was one thing that we asked his family about, his nephew. I interviewed his nephew. We interviewed the beautiful priest who was his assistant for 10 years, his right-hand man.
Marco.
And he was so articulate and spoke so well. And then I asked him the question at the end, and it was such a powerful moment in an interview. It was the first time he stopped, and he looked at me and he said, "That's the $1 million question."
We'll never-
So that was the one thing we could never really get a good conclusive answer to.
Great. Just as a final question then, so we have a lot of people of all ages here, but a good number of young people, but just from your perspective, as people of faith working in media, so both from a media perspective and from a faith perspective, what advice would you give to young people, but to anybody really? So Paola, do you want to start?
Absolutely. I love this question. I think the best thing is to have great role models, great ideals, a very good reason to be good in your life. I think Irish have a really good upper hand because they have Claire Crockett, which is a great role model. I think she's also very loved in Latin America because she passed away in Ecuador. being a wonderful woman, playing the guitar for kids in a very poor school, cleaning after big floods had put mud all over the place, just a life of service. And I think that's what truly makes you happy at the end of the day. And if young people aim for that, you just won't get distracted with silly things.
And
That's right.
Colm?
Yeah, I would think to be courageous and to not be afraid if you want to tell stories of faith and, cover Catholic stories. And to remember always, young people, that social media is not real life. And
Yes.
because something is not popular on Twitter or X and it's not trendy on Facebook and all that, that does not in any way represent the general population and the general public. And we see that all the time reflected in viewership figures where people can be giving out about one of our programs on Twitter and saying, oh, I didn't like that. And then we watch and we see the huge numbers of people
right.
who are watching
It's so important that of course, we have to be out in the world and whatever, but you have to have communities of faith somewhere so that you do realize, okay, I'm hearing this on Twitter, but that's not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And, if you believe in what you're doing, to just keep going forward and to try and do it, like I said, really well. And to find those personal interest stories and spread those stories of faith. And then
And
they will always break through. Those
that's
stories will always break through.
great.
And I also think for young people, find a talent, develop a skill. Who would have thought that a little kid from Ennis running around making newsletters would end up reporting on the church in Mongolia?
Can do nothing else. She can speak multiple languages. I'm not that bright.
And the same little girl doing plays for her brothers.
Yeah, and I would meet him through the church in Rome. So I think God puts us in this world with those set of skills, limited as we are, to do something wonderful with our lives.
And very, very finally, how we say God works in mysterious ways. I remember before I met Paola talking to Michael Warsaw, who is the CEO of EWTN, the big boss man. And I met him in Washington, D.C. in the corridors, and you see him coming down. Oh, Mr. Warsaw, hey kid, how are you? Who the hell is? He's like, who the heck is this guy? I'm like, we were talking for a moment, and he said, so how's everything with you? Good, good. And I said, yeah, and I want to meet someone, and I'd love to maybe look at what's next on the horizon, get married. He goes, oh, he said, pray to Mother Angelica. He said, pray to Mother Angelica. So after we got married, I met him again down in Florida recently at a conference in Naples, Florida. And I said, Mr. Warsaw. And I said, I did what you said. I prayed to Mother Angelica, and look who I'm after married. And he looked at her photograph and he said, this could count as one of her miracles.
And what a wonderful note to end on. Listen, it's been a real pleasure to meet you both in person, and I think you really are doing exactly what that message was, three messengers of hope. So you do inspire us. Continue to do that, and know that you have our prayers as you continue to do that. We watch you on X. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.